Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today I want to talk about the gentleman pictured here. His name is Jacob Stroyer. He was about 12 years old when the Civil War began. He grew up enslaved on a sprawling South Carolina plantation owned by the Singleton family. It was located near Columbia, about 90 miles from Fort Sumter, where, as you students of the Civil War know, the opening shots of the conflict were fired. It was in 1861. Stroyer's memoirs were published in 1879, and there's some interesting connections between himself and Fort Sumter. Before I get there, I want to read a first passage to you in which he describes his ancestry. And I'll say this as a preface. I've researched dozens of African Americans from the Civil War period, enslaved men and free men, and so few of them were able to trace their families back to Africa and know the names of their African ancestors. Well, Jacob is one of the rare examples of where I found this. So it's a short read, a couple of paragraphs, but it's revealing in what he knows about his history. So let me read this to you. He says, "My father was born in Sierra Leone, Africa. Of his parents and brothers and sisters, I know nothing. I only remember that it was said that his father's name was Moncoso and his mother's Mongamo, which names are known only among the native Africans. He was brought from Africa when but a boy and sold to old Colonel Dick Singleton, who owned a great many plantations in South Carolina. And when the old colonel divided his property among his children, father fell to the second son, Colonel M.R. Singleton. Mother was never sold, but her parents were. They were owned by one Mr. Croft, who sold them and the rest of the slaves with the plantation to Colonel Dick Singleton, upon whose place mother was born. I was born on this extensive plantation 28 miles southeast of Columbia, South Carolina, in the year 1849. I belonged to Colonel M.R. Singleton and was held in slavery up to the time of the Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Lincoln." So there's the first bit about his ancestry. And Moncoso and Mongamo. Moncoso, Moncoso, and Mongamo, Mongomo. That would be his great grandparents. No, sorry, that would be his grandparents. So that's a little bit of his ancestry. Now, I want to get to the second passage. Keep in mind, he grows up on this plantation 28 miles southeast of Columbia. And then in 1864, he winds up being in Charleston and Fort Sumter. So I want to read this to you in his own words, where he explains what happened to him while he was at Fort Sumter and during his time in Charleston. He says, "In the time of the war, in the year 1863, when a man was going around to the different plantations gathering slaves from their masters to carry off to work on fortifications and to wait on officers, there were 10 slaves sent from Mrs. Singleton's plantation, and I was among them. They carried us to Sullivan's Island at Charleston, South Carolina, and I was there all of that year. I thanked God that it afforded me a better chance for an education than I had had at home, and so I was glad to be on the island. Though I had no one to teach me, as I was thrown among those of my fellow Negroes who were fully as lame as I was in letters, yet I felt greatly relieved from being under the eye of the overseer, whose intention was to keep me from further advancement. By the way, We know the man's name from another section of the book, Bill Turner. Now, back to his passage. The year after I'd gone home, I was sent back to Fort Sumter in the year 1864. I carried my spelling book with me, and although the Northerners were firing upon us, I tried to keep up my study. In July of that same year, I was wounded by the Union soldiers on a Wednesday evening. I was taken to the city of Charleston to Dr. Regg's hospital, and there I stayed until I got well enough to travel, when I was sent to Columbia, where I was when the hour of liberty was proclaimed to me in 1865. This was the year of Jubilee, the year which my father had spoken of in the dark days of slavery, when he and mother sat up late talking of it. He said to mother, "The time will come when this boy and the rest of the children will be their own masters and mistresses." He died 6 years before that day came, but mother is still enjoying liberty with her children. And no doubt my readers would like to know how I was wounded in the war. We were obliged to do our work in the night, as they were firing on us in the day. And on a Wednesday night, just as we went out, we heard the cry of the watchman, "Look out!" There was a little lime house near the southwest corner of the fort, and some 12 or 13 of us ran into it, and all were killed but 2. A shell came down on the lime house and burst, and a piece cut my face open. But it was not my time to die, and I lived to enjoy freedom. I said that when I got so I could travel, I was sent from Dr. Ragg's hospital in Charleston to Colonel Singleton's plantation near Columbia in the last part of the year 1864. I did not do any work during the remainder of that year because I was unwell from my wound received in the fort. About that time, General Sherman came through Georgia with his 100,000 men, encamped at Columbia, South Carolina. The slaveholders were very uneasy as to how they should save other valuables, as they saw that slavery was a hopeless case. Mistress had some of her horses, mules, cows, and hogs carried down into the swamp, while the others, which were left on the plantation, were divided out to the Negroes for safekeeping, as she had heard that the Yankees would not take anything belonging to the slaves. A little pig of about 50 or 60 pounds was given to me for safekeeping. A few of the old horses and mules were taken from the plantation by the Union soldiers, but they did not trouble anything else. So Jacob Stroyer survived all of that and continued on. You might wonder what became of him. Well, he taught school for a time and moved, got his education, taught school, and moved to Massachusetts. And there he continued teaching school and went on to become a minister. And he lived until 1908, dying at about age 59. So thanks for listening. And there's the story of Jacob Stroyer, an enslaved person who was freed at the end of the war, happened to be in Fort Sumter in the summer of 1864 when it was shelled by Union soldiers, and he suffered a serious wound. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.